Hey guys, tonight we're sailing back in time. Dim the lights, pull your blanket up, and get ready to drift into the cold, rocking darkness of the medieval sea. Where sleep was rare, hammocks smelled like salt and rot, and pirates snored beside barrels of gunpowder. It's hard to picture it, isn't it? A bunch of half-starved men, sailing on a leaking wooden coffin, pretending it was a home. But somehow, they survived. Somehow they even slept. Let's set the scene. The sea isn't calm. It never really is. It moans and sighs against the hull, and every few seconds the ship groans back, like an old man complaining about his knees. The air is cold enough to bite, and the smell, a mix of sweat, wet rope, fish guts, and mold. This was bedtime for a medieval pirate. Now, when we say pirate, most people think of the 17th or 18th century kind. Fancy hats, parrots, maybe a rum bottle or two. But medieval pirates were a little rougher around the edges. They were basically unemployed sailors with knives. Vikings, Norman privateers, English sea raiders, all part of the same chaotic maritime soup. Their ships were small, cramped, and about as cozy as a wooden box left out in the rain. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort was a rumor. Let's talk about where they actually slept. There were no cabins for most of the crew. If you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean slightly higher in rank or less despised, you might claim a dry corner near the stern. Everyone else. They just found a spot on the deck, curled up like a salted sardine, and hoped not to roll overboard in their sleep. The captain might get a small enclosed space below deck, something with a low ceiling, a single candle, and a pile of furs pretending to be a bed. The rest had to make do with coils of rope, or if they were really fancy, a hammock stolen from a merchant ship. Now, hammocks weren't a medieval invention. Not really. They became common among European sailors around the 16th century, but some form of hanging cloth or netting was around earlier. Pirates, being the resourceful little thieves they were, didn't mind borrowing ideas, or hammocks, from anyone they raided. Sleeping below deck was, well, let's call it atmospheric. The floor was usually damp. Sometimes seawater sloshed in. Rats were permanent residents. And because ships were made of wood and tar, every creak sounded like the whisper of a ghost, reminding you that the ocean wanted you dead. So, how did they not freeze to death? Good question. And the short answer is, sometimes they did. But mostly, they just adapted. Layers of wool soaked in salt water and sweat worked like natural insulation. They'd wrap themselves in cloaks or old sails. Some used animal skins, others just huddled together for warmth. Human radiators on a floating death trap. Of course, sleep was rarely peaceful. The wind never stopped, the deck never stopped moving. There were storms, sudden alarms, the occasional sword fight, and that one guy who always snored like a cannon. But somehow, between the chaos, they'd drift off. Not because they were comfortable, but because exhaustion always wins. Let's float over to another detail most people forget. Light. There were no bright lanterns flickering romantically in pirate cabins. Candles were expensive and dangerous. Fire on a wooden ship was basically the nightmare version of sleep tight. So most of the time, pirates slept in near-total darkness. Maybe a faint glow from the moon through the hatch, or the red pulse of a dying ember. Enough to see your own breath in the cold. The soundscape was pure ocean lullaby. The slap of waves, the creak of ropes, the soft muttering of men dreaming of land. Occasionally interrupted by someone swearing in Latin because a rat ran over his face. But there's a strange rhythm to it, isn't there? Once your body accepted the sway, the smell, and the cold, it became normal. Sailors' bodies adapted to the rocking. Their sleep cycles followed the sea. Short naps between shifts, maybe 4 hours at a time, always broken. The concept of 8 hours of sleep didn't exist out there. Let's talk about the watch system. Medieval ships usually ran on something like a 4 hours on, 4 hours off rotation. Half the crew stayed awake steering, watching for rocks, or manning the sails. The others tried to rest. Then they'd swap. So no one ever truly slept through the night. They lived in constant half-sleep. Enough to stay alive, never enough to feel rested. And yet somehow, they functioned. Their bodies adjusted. Their minds dulled into a steady rhythm of hunger, cold, and duty. Sleep wasn't rest. It was maintenance, like blowing out a candle just long enough to keep it from burning itself out. Let's drift a little further into the daily life part. When dawn came, the ship would already smell of wet wood and stale air. The pirates who had slept would wake up stiff and miserable. They'd stretch, curse, spit over the rail, and look around like, yep, still ocean. Then it was back to work, mending sails, cleaning decks, or occasionally chasing down another ship to rob. Meals didn't help the comfort level. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was usually hardtack, which was basically stone disguised as bread, and salted meat that smelled like regret. Imagine eating that in freezing wind while pretending to feel alive. Romantic, right? But here's the thing. Pirates, despite their misery, were some of the most adaptable people alive. They built their routines around discomfort. Sleep became a skill. You could fall asleep anywhere, under a cannon, next to a barrel, even standing up if you'd been awake long enough. Some ships even had unofficial sleep spots, warm corners near the galley, or above the bilge where the air was a little thicker, but at least warmer. Of course, that meant inhaling the scent of mold, tar, and unwashed feet. But again, standards were low. Let S float over to the science part for a second. Not that medieval pirates cared much for science. But historians have found that long-term exposure to rocking motion actually changes your sleep pattern. The body starts syncing with the waves. The vestibular system, that S, the balance part in your inner ear, kind of learns to expect the motion, so sailors could fall asleep during storms that would make a landsman vomit for 12 hours straight. It's weirdly poetic. The ocean that tortured them also taught them how to rest. Now, if you're wondering about the cold, yes, it was constant, especially in the North Atlantic. Pirates heading toward Iceland, Scotland, or the Baltic froze half the time. Some slept wearing every layer they owned. Others used body heat, sleeping shoulder to shoulder like penguins in leather boots. And if you were unlucky enough to be on deck during a cold snap, you'd wrap your cloak tight, curl up near a mast, and hope your toes still worked in the morning. The ships themselves didn't help. No insulation, no heating, just a few planks between you and the sea. The only warmth came from cooking fires, small, controlled, and usually confined to a galley box filled with sand or stone. The smoke made everything smell vaguely roasted, including the people. Still, when you read sailors' journals, the ones who could write at least, you find this strange sense of peace. They complain constantly, of course, about cold, about food, about rats. But you can also feel the rhythm, the acceptance. The sea had its own lullaby, and after enough nights it pulled them under like a gentle hypnotist. The deck became their bed, the creak of the hull their lullaby, and the endless darkness of the horizon their ceiling. Let's pause here, just for a second. Take a breath. Imagine that. Lying on the deck of a medieval ship, wrapped in a damp cloak, waves slapping below, stars scattered overhead. The world's quiet except for the whisper of the wind. You can almost hear it. Yeah, that's what they fell asleep to, every night. Not peace, exactly, but something close enough. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially lasted longer than most medieval pirates did during a night watch. Let's drift back into that world, where the horizon never ended, and your bed was always damp enough to qualify as soup. So, we've covered where they slept, the ropes, the corners, the hammocks that weren't quite hammocks. But let's talk about how they slept. Pirates didn't really get to choose when to rest. The sea decided that. And the sea, as you've probably noticed, had commitment issues. Calm one minute, howling the next. So pirates learned to sleep like cats, in short bursts, half alert, and always ready to wake up swinging. Imagine lying there, your head tilted against a wet plank, the ship rocking side to side. Your brain keeps saying, "You're moving," but your body says, "Please stop." After a few weeks of that, most pirates entered a weird, semi-conscious state. Not exactly sleep, not exactly awake. Just a fog where dreams and real life blurred together. And oh, those dreams. We actually have some accounts, not many, but enough to get an idea. From sailors describing what they saw when they finally closed their eyes. Endless waves, ghost ships, faces in the water. Some swore they heard the ocean whispering their names, which, depending on how much rum they'd had, might have been hallucination or just another Tuesday. Sleep deprivation made it worse. After weeks without real rest, sailors saw lights dancing over the waves, what they called St. Elmo's fire. It's a real weather phenomenon, but to them it was a sign. Some thought it was a blessing, others a curse. Either way, it meant you'd soon be too tired to care. Let's float over to another small but grim detail: illness. Ships were floating hospitals without doctors. Scurvy, lice, dysentery, all regular guests on board. You can imagine how nice that smelled in an enclosed space where people also slept. Lice bit through every layer of clothing. Fleas were unavoidable. And rats, they were practically pets. So when a pirate actually managed to fall asleep, it was usually interrupted by scratching, coughing, or someone vomiting 2 feet away. Yet, somehow, the human body just adapted. The brain started tuning out the chaos, the way city people eventually stop hearing traffic. Some pirates even found comfort in the noise. The creaking wood became a lullaby. The sound of waves was constant, rhythmic. And if the ship wasn't leaking too badly, that sound meant you were still alive, still floating. It's strange, right? We think of the ocean as peaceful, but back then it was a kind of quiet misery. Calm enough to rest in, brutal enough to remind you that comfort didn't belong there. Now let's talk about sleeping through storms. It sounds impossible, but it happened. When tempests rolled in, crews often worked non-stop, hours or even days without sleep. Once the storm passed, they'd collapse wherever they stood. Some fell asleep on wet ropes, others on barrels. There are stories of sailors nodding off while standing, leaning into the mast like it was a pillow from hell. The human body, when pushed that far, just gives up negotiating. You could be freezing, soaked, half-starved, didn't matter. If you were tired enough, you'd sleep. And the cold didn't stop it either. Wool, despite being eternally damp, was surprisingly good insulation. The layers trapped air, and even though they smelled like something that had died twice, they kept body heat in. Pirates also used whatever they stole: animal hides, blankets, sails. Sometimes they'd sleep near barrels of pitch or tar, because the thick smell and warmth from the sun made that spot slightly less awful. The ocean might have been cold, but human laziness was warmer. Let's not forget the officers. Captains and quartermasters usually had private quarters. Small wooden boxes below deck with just enough space for a table, maybe a cot, and their ego. These were technically beds, but still miserable. The ceiling was low, the candlelight faint, and everything creaked. But at least you could close a door. Privacy was the one luxury the captain could count on. Well, that and the occasional stolen feather pillow from a captured merchant. Now, since pirates weren't exactly known for interior decorating, most bedding consisted of furs, old cloth, or stolen merchant linens. The problem was moisture. The sea air soaked everything. Even your dreams felt damp. Nothing ever fully dried. If you hung your cloak to dry overnight, it just froze instead. Still, they slept. And sometimes, they even liked it. That's the odd part. Many pirate memoirs, especially from the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, describe life at sea with a sort of melancholy fondness. The discomfort became part of the rhythm, the cold, the hunger, the brief naps. It stripped away everything unnecessary. There was no royal etiquette, no noble nonsense. Just men, a ship, and the endless night. For some, that was freedom. For others, madness, usually both. Now, if you're wondering how they stayed sane on long voyages, they didn't really. Lack of sleep messes with your brain chemistry. It dulls your emotions, blurs your memories, and sometimes makes you see things that aren't there. There are records of entire crews swearing they saw ghost ships or sea monsters, which might have just been a combination of fog and exhaustion-induced teamwork. You could say pirates were some of the first people to experience long-term sleep studies, conducted unwillingly in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by water and regret. Let's shift to mornings again, or what passed for them. A pirate morning was whenever someone yelled at you to wake up. There were no clocks, no gentle alarms, just the sound of a man shouting that the wind had changed, or that someone needed to scrub the deck before it started growing mushrooms again. You'd get up, stretch, Wipe salt from your eyes and immediately regret being alive. Breakfast was cold, sometimes moldy, often shared with rats. Then, right back to work. Hoisting sails, patching ropes, or if you were lucky, raiding someone else's ship and stealing their slightly better breakfast. And yet, you could almost call it a routine. The sea didn't care about comfort, but it gave them rhythm. Work, watch, eat, sleep, repeat. Over time, that monotony became soothing, like clockwork waves. Even the nightmares followed the same pattern. Dreams of drowning, falling, or watching ships burn. Not exactly relaxing, but they became normal. Pirates joked about it, made songs about it, even used it as a badge of toughness. If you could sleep through a storm, you'd earned your sea legs, and probably your sea lungs too. But there's a softer side here, hidden under the grime. When ships anchored or docked for repairs, pirates often spent their first night on land sleeping for 12 straight hours. Some collapsed in taverns, others on the beach. There are even stories of men kissing the ground before lying down like it was the world's most comfortable mattress. After months of rocking on waves, solid ground must have felt like a miracle. Still, after a few days on land, many couldn't sleep properly. The stillness was too strange. No creaking wood, no waves, just silence. Their bodies missed the motion, the rhythm. Some even got land sickness, feeling dizzy when standing still. So they go back to the sea, because misery was at least familiar. And that, in a weird way, tells you everything about pirates. They didn't chase comfort. They chased the feeling of belonging somewhere, even if that somewhere was a frozen death trap covered in barnacles. Let's float to one last thought for this part. The strange calm of isolation. Out there, far from land, surrounded by darkness and cold. The only warmth was human. Pirates slept close not because they liked each other, but because it kept them alive, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in rags, breathing the same damp air. For all their violence and greed, they depended on each other more than they ever admitted. And maybe, when the waves were calm and the stars bright enough to see your own breath, that was enough. Not comfort, not peace, but something close. Still here, still floating? Good. Let's stay adrift a little longer, and the sea's not done with us yet. We've already seen how medieval pirates tried to sleep. Now let's talk about how they managed to stay alive while doing it. Because on a pirate ship, sleep wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. Remember, ships in the Middle Ages didn't have door locks or cozy quarters. The ocean wasn't their only threat. There were storms, mutinies, rival ships, and the occasional crew member who thought stabbing was a reasonable form of conflict resolution. So pirates had a rule: never sleep too deeply. They worked in watches, rotating shifts through the night. Usually 2 or 3 groups divided the 24-hour day into chunks. Yeoman crew steered, repaired, and kept lookout, while the others caught what little rest they could. After a few hours, they'd switch. It kept the ship running and the men alive, though it also meant nobody ever got more than 3 or 4 hours of real sleep. You could think of it as the world's first communal insomnia program. Let's float north for a moment, to the Vikings, the original sea raiders. They were technically earlier than medieval pirates. But spiritually, they were the same people, tired, cold, and mildly unhinged. Vikings slept under decks or in open-air longships, wrapped in animal skins. Some ships didn't even have shelter. You'd just lie down between rowing benches, pull a cloak over your head, and pretend the freezing spray was refreshing. Viking sagas mention men sleeping in their armor, partly to stay warm, partly in case someone decided to attack at 2 a.m., which, apparently, happened often enough to justify it. Mediterranean pirates had it slightly easier. The weather was warmer, and their ships, like galleys, had more structure. But warmth came with its own curse. Bugs, fleas, lice, and mosquitoes made sleeping a full-contact sport. There are records of sailors setting small smoke fires to keep insects away, which probably didn't help their lungs, but did make the night smell like burnt despair. So, in a way, every pirate crew just chose their misery. Cold and wet in the north, hot and itchy in the south. Pick your poison. Now, when pirates anchored or went quiet during long stretches at sea, night watches became sacred. They worked in pairs, one man scanning the horizon, another minding the tiller. Silence was required. Any noise that didn't sound like waves or ropes was suspicious, You could hear a shout travel for miles over calm water, which made stealthy sleep impossible. The men below deck slept in shifts so small it barely counted as rest. Some didn't even bother lying down. They'd just lean against barrels or sit on coils of rope, hat over their face, drifting off while still holding a knife. Because trust on a pirate ship was flexible. There's a recorded case from a 14th century English raider crew, not quite pirates, but close enough, where a man was stabbed in his sleep for snoring too loud. His bunkmates claimed it was self-defense. The captain agreed. Case closed. So yes, you could say quiet sleep was a survival skill, and speaking of survival, the temperature at night was no joke. The sea air cut through fabric like glass. Ships collected condensation on the inside of their hulls, which meant everything was wet, even things that hadn't touched water in days. Blankets froze stiff, boots turned solid. In winter, pirates sometimes slept sitting up, just to avoid frostbite from lying on the planks. Those who had furs or sheepskins used them as bedding, but most relied on layers, tunics, wool shirts, maybe a stolen cloak or two. The smell of unwashed wool and salt became permanent. You could tell a sailor by scent long before you saw him. Let's not forget that pirates also shared their beds with cargo. Ships were packed to the brim, barrels, ropes, spare sails, sometimes livestock. Chickens and goats were common on longer voyages, so you might fall asleep to the soothing sound of waves and wake up to a goat chewing your sleeve. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Now, let's talk about rank again. Captains and quartermasters had the luxury of choice. Their cabins were still damp and miserable, but compared to the open deck, they might as well have been royal chambers. A captain's bed was usually a wooden frame or box, with a thin mattress stuffed with straw or feathers. It looked comfortable, but it wasn't. The straw absorbed moisture and went mouldy fast. Still, at least it was his. Below him, the officers or helmsmen might sleep near the stern, warmer, slightly quieter, and closer to the rum supply. The rest of the crew sprawled wherever space existed, often overlapping. Pirates didn't believe in personal space, they believed in not freezing. If you've ever been on a wooden boat at night, you'll understand how little stands between you and the sound of the sea. Every wave echoes through the hull. It's almost meditative. That constant rhythmic knock, 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 like a heartbeat under your body. For a while it feels comforting. Then it gets inside your head. Sailors described hearing the ocean even in their dreams. Or worse, on land, long after they'd left it. They'd wake up in taverns years later, still rocking, still hearing the creak of ropes. Some never stopped swaying. The sea didn't let them go. Let's drift to another odd little detail. Superstition. Pirates were deeply superstitious about sleep. Some believed that dreams at sea were messages, warnings, or omens. If a man dreamed of falling overboard, he'd refuse to work near the rail the next day. If he dreamed of a woman, it meant a storm was coming. And if someone died in their sleep, the crew whispered that the ocean had called him home. They'd wrap the body, tie it to a cannonball, and slide it into the sea. The ship would go quiet for a few hours. Nobody wanted to sleep that night. Pirate life was rough, but the human need for rest was stubborn. Some crews developed small rituals before sleep, little acts of comfort, cleaning their knives, saying a quick prayer, rubbing salt on their boots to keep them soft. There's something almost touching about it, these hardened men going through bedtime routines like children who just happen to own cutlasses, and yet, for all the misery, they found ways to make it bearable. On calm nights, they'd tell stories before turning in. Legends, jokes, bits of gossip about ports they hadn't seen in years. Someone might hum a tune, soft and slow. Others would listen, heads tilted back, eyes half closed. The ship swayed, the stars shimmered, and for a brief moment, it almost felt human. That's the strange beauty of pirate sleep. It wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance. They learned to rest without resting, to find peace in noise, to close their eyes knowing the sea might take them, and somehow to accept that. If you've ever had a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the world, imagine that feeling, stretched across endless waves centuries ago. The same exhaustion, the same surrender, just colder, wetter, and with more rats. And still, they slept. Because even pirates needed dreams. If you've made it this far, you're practically part of the crew. Don't worry, we're not handing you a mop yet. Just a quiet corner on deck and a cold breeze for company. By now you know that medieval pirates didn't really sleep the way we think of it. It was more like collapsing in shifts, wrapped in damp wool, trying not to roll into the sea. But what's interesting is that out of all that chaos, patterns began to form. Small, shared habits that turned into something like culture. Let's start with the Arab corsairs of the Mediterranean. Warm waters, clear skies, slightly less frostbite, slightly more sunburn. Corsairs, especially those from the Barbary coast, were skilled sailors who mixed piracy with privateering and trade. Their ships were sleek and fast, meant for ambush, not comfort. But in the warm night air they sometimes slept right on deck, under the stars. Thin mats of woven palm or rough cloth served as bedding. A cool breeze off the water was better than a stuffy cabin. They even had a kind of nighttime order. Crews would pray before sleeping, sometimes quietly, sometimes all together. Religion was as much a part of their routine as the tides. And that gave their sleep a rhythm, less chaos, more ceremony. The sound of murmured prayers drifting over calm water was their version of a lullaby. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Hanseatic raiders and Baltic pirates were living the opposite life. Cold, dark, and damp. 3 favorite adjectives of the medieval sea. Those ships were heavier and slower, built for hauling goods and occasionally stealing them. Nights in the Baltic were brutal. Even in summer, the temperature dropped fast. Crews slept packed together below deck, huddled under thick wool blankets that never truly dried. The air inside those holds was heavy, stale, and smelled like wet rope and smoke. If one man sneezed, half the crew got sick by morning. But that shared misery created its own sort of discipline. They started timing watches by stars or candles, keeping strict rotations to make sure the helmsman never drifted off. It wasn't out of kindness. It was survival. One missed shift could mean running aground or colliding with a rock. Over time, those habits became standardized, passed from one crew to another, until even the roughest pirate ships had something like a schedule. So, in a strange twist, pirates, the ultimate rebels, helped shape early naval order. They didn't mean to, but necessity is bossier than any admiral. Now, let's swing over to the English Channel. By the 13th and 14th centuries, it was crawling with privateers, legal pirates, depending on who you asked. These men raided enemy ships under royal permission, which sounds noble until you realize it was just piracy with better PR. Their ships had small sleeping areas called berths. Picture wooden shelves barely big enough for one person stacked along the hull. A thin straw mat, a blanket, and that was it. Each man had his own space, sort of. The air was still foul, the ceiling low, but compared to open-deck sleeping it was luxury. And from these setups came something remarkable. Early watch bells. Sailors would strike a small bell to mark each change in watch. 2 bells meant 2 hours had passed, 4 bells meant 4 hours, and so on. It kept time, but it also structured rest. You could predict when your shift ended, when you'd get to lie down, even when you might hear the next bell in your half-sleep. That steady rhythm, the sound of the watch bell echoing in the dark, became the heartbeat of ship life. If you've ever heard the phrase 8 bells, that's where it started. And yes, pirates used it too. Not because they liked order, but because they liked not dying in their sleep. Now, one thing about sleeping on ships: the ocean always moves. The rocking was constant, a slow, hypnotic sway that seeped into every muscle. At first, it made new sailors nauseous, but after weeks they couldn't sleep without it. The human body is weirdly adaptable that way. You could put a sailor on solid ground, and he'd still feel phantom waves under his feet. Some even missed it. That gentle rise and fall, the creak of the timbers. The motion became home. Let's zoom out for a moment. By the late Middle Ages, pirate life had changed. Ships were getting bigger, voyages were longer. Crews were more organized, at least organized enough to function. And with that came routines. Sleep rotations, meal times, even quiet hours. Not because they valued rest, but because fatigue killed efficiency. You could say pirates invented shift work before factories ever existed. They slept in rhythm with the sea, their bodies sinking to tides and bells. It wasn't comfort, but it was control, and that tiny bit of control, in a world ruled by chaos, probably felt like power. Some pirates, especially captains who'd seen too many winters, developed personal rituals. They'd light a single lantern before sleep, muttering to themselves or scribbling in journals. Others carried small charms, bits of bone or coin, to ward off bad dreams. There was a quiet superstition that the sea could visit you in your sleep, and if it liked you, it might take you early. And that fear shaped how they rested. Always lightly, always half ready to wake. If a storm rolled in, sleep vanished instantly. Orders were shouted, sails pulled down, ropes lashed tight. No one complained. The ocean's temper didn't wait for you to finish a nap. When the storm finally passed, they'd lie down wherever they were, wet, shivering, but somehow grateful to still be there. There's something strangely peaceful about that image. Dozens of exhausted men, scattered across the deck, asleep under a sky that had just tried to kill them. The stars peeking through torn clouds, the wind quiet for once. That was the closest thing they had to peace, and maybe that's what this story's really about. Not how they slept, but how they rested. Pirate life wasn't about comfort, it was about learning to live inside discomfort until it became normal. To find small moments of calm between waves, a few hours of stillness in a world that never stopped moving. So when you hear the word pirate, maybe don't picture rum and treasure maps. Picture a man wrapped in a ragged cloak, lying beside a coil of rope, eyes half shut, rocking gently with the sea. Too tired to dream, too stubborn to die. That's how medieval pirates really slept. Cold, hungry, but oddly at peace. The ocean didn't give them comfort, it gave them rhythm. And somehow, that was enough. If you're still here, still drifting through the waves with me, then you've earned your sea legs, and probably a nap yourself. Let's start where we left off. The quiet after the storm. A ship in calm water, the sails slack, the sea whispering against the hull. All around, a crew sleeping wherever exhaustion caught them. That scene, rough, raw, peaceful, was the nightly reality for centuries of pirates, sailors, and wanderers. But what S often overlooked is how that strange world of sleeplessness and rhythm slowly shaped how humanity itself learned to rest. Because, in a way, the ocean taught discipline before clocks did. The pirates of the Middle Ages lived by tides, not timepieces. Yet, their routines, the rotating watches, the bell signals, the shared exhaustion, built the framework for what would later become naval order. When Europe's first professional navies formed in the 1500s and 1600s, they borrowed pirate practices almost wholesale. They just added uniforms and punishment for breaking them. Think about that for a second. The same men who once slept in piles of wet rope and rum-stained blankets accidentally invented modern shift work. When you hear a modern sailor talk about 4 hours on, 4 hours off, that's not a military invention. That's medieval pirate life, polished by bureaucracy. And yet, even with all the change, the bigger ships, the hammocks, the cleaner quarters, the sea never really stopped being what it always was, a test of endurance. Let's talk about hammocks for a moment. The hammock, as simple as it looks, was revolutionary. It came from the Caribbean. Indigenous Arawak and Taino people used woven cotton nets to sleep cool and above ground. European sailors saw it, copied it, and brought it aboard ships. By the 16th century, naval fleets and pirate crews alike were stringing hammocks in every corner. Why? Because hammocks moved with the ship. They swayed with the same rhythm as the sea, keeping the sleeper stable instead of being tossed around. They also kept men off the damp deck, away from rats and rotting food. For the first time, sailors, even pirates, could actually sleep through a night without sliding into a puddle or waking with a cramp. A pirate captain once said that a good hammock saves more men than a sharp sword. And he was right. Rest meant alertness. Alertness meant survival. Still, sleep on a pirate ship was never peaceful. There was always noise. The creak of wood, the slap of water, the murmurs of half-dreaming men. Some sang to themselves, others whispered prayers. Many just stared into the dark, waiting for the next watch bell to call them back. But there was a strange beauty in it too. Imagine this. It's midnight, somewhere in the 14th century. The sea is black glass. The stars are scattered, pale and cold. A dozen hammocks swing in rhythm, each holding a man whose life depends on the weather. Somewhere above, a lookout hums softly to keep himself awake. The ship groans. The world is nothing but wood and water and breath. That was their version of peace. And when morning came, when the first orange light touched the horizon, they'd wake stiff, hungry, but alive. And that was enough. That cycle, that blend of exhaustion and gratitude, shaped the soul of sea life. You worked until you couldn't. You slept when you could, and you woke when the ocean allowed it. In a sense, every sailor learned humility that way. You couldn't command the sea. You could only learn to rest within its moods. And maybe that is the lesson buried inside all this history, one that reaches beyond the masts and fog and frozen decks. We think of pirates as wild men chasing gold and glory, but most of their lives were quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. They weren't heroes or villains. They were just people trying to find small comforts in an endless, dangerous world. They learned that rest wasn't about luxury. It was about surrender. To the sea, to the moment. To the simple fact that you can't fight sleep forever. So tonight, if you're lying in your own version of that hammock, maybe a bed, maybe a couch, and the world outside feels a little uncertain, remember them. Remember the men who found sleep in the coldest, darkest corners of the earth. Close your eyes. Let the rhythm of your own breathing become the tide, and let yourself drift, just like they did. The sea always wins eventually, and sometimes that's not such a bad thing. We were in the quiet hours now, the part of the night where even the sea seems to be whispering in its sleep. If you've ever stared too long into the dark, you'll understand what haunted those sailors most. Not storms, not starvation, but the silence between waves. Because at sea, silence was never truly silent. There were always soft creaks, ropes tightening, sails fluttering like slow heartbeats. Sometimes the ship made noises no one could explain, wood expanding, nails groaning. But to a man half asleep on watch, those sounds could feel alive. And that's when the stories began. Pirates, being human and deeply superstitious, filled the night with ghosts. They said that lost sailors came back as lights dancing on the water. St. Elmo's fire, they called it, though science would later say it was just static electricity. But for them, it was proof that the dead never left the sea. So while some men slept, others watched. And in that strange half-awake world, sleep and dream began to blur. Imagine lying in your hammock. The sea rocks you gently, the ropes creak above. You've been awake for 2 days straight, your muscles stiff, your mind drifting. You start to hear voices, maybe a song, maybe your own thoughts echoing off the wood. You don't know anymore. That was how most pirates dreamed, not in beds, but in motion. Their dreams smelled like salt and smoke. They were shaped by fear and fatigue, by hunger and laughter. There are fragments of old logbooks that mention dreams of land. Sailors would see green hills and soft earth in their sleep, only to wake up to the same grey waves. Some broke down, others just laughed. It's strange, but maybe the most human thing about pirates was how they longed for normal sleep. They wanted the kind where you could roll over without falling into a crate of gunpowder. The kind where you woke up to sunlight instead of shouting. The kind where dreams didn't smell like tar and death. But the sea didn't allow that kind of rest. It demanded its own rhythm. Strange, uneven, but eternal. Even captains weren't spared. They slept little, often in narrow cabins that felt more like coffins than rooms. One storm could destroy everything, and so even in sleep they listened. To the ship, to the waves, to the voices of their crew. That constant half-awareness left marks. Old sailors often complained that they could never sleep soundly on land again. The stillness of a room made them anxious. They missed the motion, the creak, the endless lullaby of the ocean. They'd lie awake, waiting for a wave that never came. And that's what centuries of sea life did to people. It rewired their sense of calm. To them, danger became comfort, noise became peace. So when we picture pirates sleeping peacefully under the stars, we might be imagining something that never truly existed. Their rest wasn't peaceful. It was survival dressed up as sleep. But maybe that's why their stories linger. Because even in the roughest corners of life, they still tried to rest, still tried to dream. And that, in its own strange way, feels timeless. We've reached the last stretch of this voyage. In our next and final part, we'll drift through the dawn, the moment when pirate ships came back to life, when hammocks emptied, and when the sea decided who got to wake up another day.